The bunting hung, with determined cheerfulness, between the ancient yew trees of St. Mary Mead's village green, though the afternoon heat had caused it to sag slightly, as if even festive decorations found the effort of celebration somewhat taxing. Tables draped in checked cloths bore the traditional offerings of such occasions, cucumber sandwiches with their edges beginning to curl despite Mrs. Bantry's best efforts. Fairy cakes standing in neat rows like small sugar-dusted soldiers, and the inevitable Victoria sponge that would be judged with the solemnity reserved for matters of village pride. The occasion was the Penny Post Jubilee, a celebration marking the centenary of the village post office, combined with the annual summer fete to raise funds for the church roof. The new postmaster, Mr. Edwin Blackthorne, had arrived from London only 3 months prior, and this was his first opportunity to prove himself worthy of succeeding old Mrs. Weatherby, who had managed the village's correspondence for nearly 40 years before her retirement. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary position at such gatherings, a folding chair positioned strategically between sun and shade beneath the oak tree, her knitting needles clicking with gentle precision. To the casual observer, she appeared to be nothing more than an elderly lady enjoying the afternoon's festivities, but her pale blue eyes missed very little of the human drama unfolding around her. She had learned, over many decades of village life, that the most interesting revelations often occurred not in moments of high drama, but in the small, unguarded gestures people made when they believed themselves unobserved. Mr. Blackthorne himself provided an interesting study. A thin, meticulously dressed man in his 40s, he moved through the crowd with the careful precision of someone still learning the intricate social geography of village life. He had arranged a modest exhibition near the post office pillar box, which gleamed with fresh red paint, displaying historical letters and curious postal artifacts. The centerpiece was a framed letter with a small placard reading, "A letter that arrived too late, 1911, accompanied by the story of how a delayed message had caused a gentleman to miss a crucial train, thus altering the entire course of his career. The irony of this display would later prove more significant than anyone could have imagined. Near the refreshment table, Mrs. Sylvia Carraway moved through the crowd with the composed grace that had made her one of the village's most respected residents since her arrival 2 years ago, following her husband's death. A handsome woman in her early 40s, she had the particular poise of someone who had learned to navigate social situations with diplomatic skill. Today she wore a dove-gray dress that complemented her dark hair and carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who had found her place in the community through careful cultivation of useful friendships and judicious committee work. Miss Marple observed that Mrs. Carraway seemed to be avoiding the immediate vicinity of Mr. Blackthorne's postal exhibition, though she glanced toward it occasionally with an expression that suggested mild irritation rather than interest. When their eyes met briefly across the green, Mr. Blackthorne's face tightened almost imperceptibly, and he turned his attention back to his display with unnecessary concentration. Colonel Roger Hartnell, the village's self-appointed expert on all matters military and postal, held court near the exhibition, regaling anyone within earshot with his theories about the historical significance of watermarks and the decline of proper correspondence in modern times. "Stamps tell the true history of nations," he declared to Dr. Felix Rowe, who listened with the patient expression of a man accustomed to humoring his neighbor's obsessions. "Politicians lie, but a postmark never does." Dr. Rowe, a tall, quietly competent man who had served the village faithfully for 15 years, nodded politely while keeping one eye on the crowd, a habit born of years of being summoned to tend scraped knees and elderly ladies' palpitations during such events. Today, however, his attention seemed particularly focused on Mrs. Carraway, though whether from professional concern or personal interest was difficult to determine. The afternoon's peaceful rhythm was maintained by the gentle sounds of village life, The clink of teacups, the distant laughter of children at the coconut shy, and the industrious stamping of young Tom Pierce, who had been given the honor of demonstrating the postal date stamp at a small table near the exhibition. The boy took his responsibility seriously, carefully pressing the rubber stamp onto cards with the precision of someone performing an important civic duty. It was precisely at 2:30 when the moment arrived that would transform this pleasant afternoon into something altogether more sinister. Tom Pierce, pedaling his red bicycle with the enthusiasm of youth, careened onto the green calling out, special delivery for Mrs. Sylvia Carraway." The assembled villagers turned with the mild excitement that any suggestion of importance brings to a quiet community. Tom skidded to a halt near the refreshment table, producing from his bag an official-looking envelope with a blue-edged label and a stamp that had been pressed down with perhaps too much enthusiasm, leaving one corner slightly lifted. Mrs. Carraway accepted the letter with steady hands, though Miss Marple noticed that her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the envelope. She thanked Tom with her usual courtesy, giving him a coin that satisfied both his services and his discretion. The crowd's attention began to drift back to their conversations and refreshments, but Miss Marple continued to watch as Mrs. Carraway moved toward a quieter area near the small marquee that housed the cake competition entries. Using a small silver fruit knife, an oddly formal implement for a village fete, Mrs. Carraway opened the envelope with precise movements. Miss Marple observed her face as she read, noting the subtle tightening around her eyes, the way her lips compressed into a thin line, and the careful control with which she folded the letter once, twice, and slipped it into her handbag. "The sun is rather warm," Mrs. Carraway announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying its usual pleasant tone despite the tension Miss Marple had observed in her posture. "I think I shall find some shade." She moved away from the center of activities with measured steps, heading toward the narrow passage between the marquee and the hedge, where the afternoon shadows provided a cool retreat from the heat. Dr. Rowe, perhaps responding to some instinct born of years attending to his patients, excused himself from Colonel Hartnell's discourse and followed at a discreet distance. Miss Iris Denham, the village school teacher, had been standing nearby and witnessed the entire exchange. "I don't like the look of that," she murmured to Miss Marple, settling into the chair that Mrs. Carraway had vacated. She looked like someone had just told her the worst possible news at the worst possible moment. "Letters," Miss Marple observed gently, her needles never pausing in their rhythm, "have a way of arriving precisely when they can do the most damage. It's quite remarkable, really, how timing can transform information from a mere inconvenience into something altogether more serious." The fete continued around them with its gentle bustle, but Miss Marple found herself paying particular attention to the small details that others might overlook. The way Mr. Blackthorne kept glancing toward the marquee, the nervous energy with which he rearranged his postal display, and the fact that Colonel Hartnell's bombastic commentary had taken on a slightly forced quality, as if he were working harder than usual to maintain his audience's attention. It was young Tom Pierce who, having finished his stamping duties and wandered off in search of lemonade, made the discovery that would shatter the afternoon's tranquility. His cry of "Miss, oh Miss," carried across the green with a note of genuine alarm that cut through the pleasant murmur of conversation like a knife through silk. The crowd turned toward the sound, and those nearest hurried toward the marquee where Tom stood pointing with a shaking finger toward the shadowed passage behind the tent. There, in the cool space between canvas and hedge, Mrs. Sylvia Carraway lay motionless, her dove-gray dress spread around her like spilled water, one gloved hand still clutching her handbag with the desperate grip of someone who had tried, even in her final moments, to maintain control. Dr. Rowe was the first to reach her, kneeling beside the still form with the swift efficiency of his profession. His examination was brief but thorough, and when he looked up, his face bore the grave expression that confirmed what the gathering crowd had begun to fear. "I'm afraid Mrs. Carraway is dead," he announced quietly, his words carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen over the fete. "We must send for Inspector Slack immediately." Miss Marple approached the scene with the unhurried steps of someone who had, regrettably, encountered such situations before. She observed the way Mrs. Carroway's body lay, not in the sprawled abandon of a natural collapse, but with a careful arrangement that suggested she had been positioned after death. The silver fruit knife lay nearby, its blade clean, but for a few drops of what might have been blood, though the light made it difficult to be certain. Most significantly, the corner of the blue-edged letter protruded from Mrs. Carroway's handbag, its official appearance somehow ominous in the afternoon shadows. Whatever message it contained had arrived at precisely the right time to be read, but far too late to prevent the tragedy that had followed. As the crowd began to disperse under Dr. Rowe's gentle but firm directions, Miss Marple noticed that Mr. Blackthorne had disappeared entirely from the gathering and that the postal exhibition stood abandoned, its cheerful display of historical correspondence now seeming almost mocking in light of recent events. The letter that had arrived too late had indeed altered the course of someone's life, though not in the way its sender could ever have intended. The penny post jubilee had come to an abrupt and tragic end, but for Miss Marple, the real investigation was only just beginning. The transformation of the village green from festive gathering to crime scene occurred with the peculiar swiftness that only tragedy can achieve. Within moments of Dr. Rowe's quiet announcement, the cheerful bunting seemed to droop with newfound gravity, and the abandoned cake competition took on an almost mocking quality. Miss Marple observed how quickly the crowd reorganized itself, forming small clusters of whispered conversation while maintaining a respectful distance from the shadowed passage where Mrs. Carroway lay beneath Dr. Rowe's improvised shroud of borrowed tablecloth. Young Tom Pierce, still pale from his discovery, found himself the reluctant center of attention as villagers pressed him for details. Miss Marple beckoned the boy with a gentle gesture, offering him the corner of her handkerchief for his sticky fingers before asking, in her deceptively casual manner, about the letter he had delivered. Tom, desperate to be helpful, explained that Mr. Blackthorne himself had given him the envelope, emphasizing its urgency and the need for immediate delivery to Mrs. Carroway on the green. "It was stiff," Tom added, his voice gaining confidence as he recalled the details, "as if there was something inside stronger than paper, and the stamp was coming loose at one corner, so I pressed it down with my thumb. Mr. Blackthorne laughed and said I'd make a fine postmaster one day." The boy's eyes drifted toward the abandoned postal exhibition, and Miss Marple noted his confusion at Mr. Blackthorne's conspicuous absence. The arrival of Inspector Slack's black motor car sent a ripple of both relief and renewed anxiety through the assembled villagers. The inspector emerged with characteristic briskness, a stocky man whose confidence in his abilities often exceeded his actual competence, and surveyed the scene with the expression of someone preparing to solve the matter through sheer force of authority. His constable began stringing tape around the area, transforming the festive green into something altogether more sinister. "Right then," Inspector Slack announced, consulting his notebook with unnecessary flourish. "I'll need to speak with whoever found the body. These village matters are usually straightforward once you cut through the gossip." Dr. Rowe stepped forward with quiet dignity, providing his professional assessment, while Tom recounted his discovery with admirable clarity for someone of his age and circumstances. Inspector Slack examined the blue-edged envelope with particular interest, announcing that it bore the letterhead of Messrs. Whitmore, Carstairs and Associates, a London solicitors' firm. The mention of London solicitors sent a visible ripple through the crowd, for in communities like St. Mary Mead, correspondence from legal firms rarely brought welcome news. Various theories began to emerge with the particular velocity that shocking events achieve in small villages. Mrs. Bantry, pressing a hand to her pearls, suggested the heat had proved too much, while Colonel Hartnell, affronted by any suggestion that weather could outdo willpower, declared that ladies took too little salt. Miss Denham, pale and thoughtful, whispered about people in novels dying of shock more often than doctors allowed. It was Miss Denham who provided the most significant observation when Inspector Slack asked about Mrs. Carroway's behavior. "She seemed to be avoiding the postal exhibition," she said hesitantly. "I noticed because it was such a lovely display, and Mrs. Carroway was usually so interested in historical matters. But every time she moved near that area, she would find some reason to go in a different direction." This comment drew all eyes toward the edge of the crowd, where Mr. Blackthorne had quietly reappeared, maintaining a careful distance from the proceedings. His face bore the expression of someone who wished desperately to be elsewhere, and he kept glancing toward the village road as if contemplating departure. "I'm sure I wouldn't know why," Mr. Blackthorne said quickly when pressed about Mrs. Carroway's avoidance. "We had very little personal conversation. She was always perfectly polite, of course, but we weren't, that is, our interactions were purely professional." Miss Marple detected something in his tone that suggested their interactions had been rather less cordial than his words implied. She made a mental note to observe Mr. Blackthorne more closely, for in her experience, people who insisted too strongly upon the professional nature of their relationships often had more personal feelings involved than they cared to admit. Inspector Slack began organizing individual interviews, starting with Dr. Rowe as the first to examine the deceased. Miss Marple settled back in her chair, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm as she prepared to observe the proceedings with the patient attention of someone who understood that the most important information often emerged not from what people said, but from what they carefully avoided saying. The investigation was beginning in earnest, and she suspected that before it concluded, several of her neighbors would discover that their carefully maintained secrets were not nearly as well hidden as they had believed. The makeshift interview area that Inspector Slack had established near the vicarage tent took on an increasingly somber atmosphere as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the village green. Miss Marple positioned herself strategically within earshot, her knitting providing the perfect cover for her careful observation of both the questioner and the questioned. She had learned over many years that people often revealed more through their silences and hesitations than through their actual words. Dr. Rowe's interview proceeded with the methodical precision one would expect from a medical professional. When pressed about his examination of Mrs. Carroway, he maintained his clinical objectivity while providing details that painted a troubling picture. The deceased showed no obvious signs of trauma or struggle, he explained to Inspector Slack, his hands folded carefully in his lap. However, the positioning of the body was unusually composed for someone who had suffered a sudden collapse. In my experience, cardiac episodes typically result in a more natural arrangement of the limbs. Inspector Slack scribbled notes furiously, though Miss Marple suspected he was more impressed by the doctor's authoritative tone than by the subtle implications of his observations. Dr. Rowe continued with professional restraint, mentioning that he had noticed a small nick on Mrs. Carroway's forefinger and a corresponding smear on the silver fruit knife, though he emphasized that such minor injuries were common at outdoor gatherings where people handled various implements. What troubled me more, Dr. Rowe added thoughtfully, was her demeanor in recent weeks. Mrs. Carroway had consulted me about sleeping difficulties approximately 6 weeks ago. She mentioned that certain stresses were affecting her rest, though she was quite circumspect about the specific nature of these concerns. Professional discretion prevents me from elaborating, but I will say that she appeared to be someone carrying a significant burden. Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly at this revelation. In her extensive experience with village life, she had observed that when respectable widows began losing sleep over unnamed stresses, it usually indicated that their carefully constructed new lives were being threatened by shadows from their past. Colonel Hartnell's interview provided a different perspective entirely, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed his military training had equipped him to notice details that escaped civilian observation. Mrs. Carroway was definitely agitated about something today, he declared with conviction. Not obviously so, mind you, but I could tell. She kept checking her watch and glancing toward the post office. When young Pierce delivered that letter, you could see it affected her profoundly. Whatever was in that envelope, she had been both expecting it and dreading it. The Colonel's observations, while delivered with characteristic bombast, contained enough accuracy to catch Miss Marple's attention. She had noticed similar signs of anticipatory anxiety in Mrs. Carroway's behavior, though she had interpreted them somewhat differently than the Colonel's military assessment suggested. When Inspector Slack finally examined the contents of Mrs. Carroway's handbag, the assembled villagers watched with the collective attention of people who understood that this moment would either confirm or dispel their various theories about the afternoon's tragedy. The inspector withdrew the blue-edged envelope with ceremonial care, noting aloud the sender's address: Messrs. Whitmore, Carstairs, and Associates of Lincoln's Inn Fields, London. The envelope had been opened with the precise cut that Miss Marple had observed Mrs. Carroway making with her silver fruit knife. Inspector Slack's fingers probed inside the envelope, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion as he encountered not the expected legal documents, but merely a single piece of stiff cardboard of the sort solicitors use to prevent papers from folding during transit. "Empty," he announced with obvious bewilderment, holding the envelope toward the light as if additional contents might materialize. "There's nothing here but a backing card. No letter, no documents, nothing at all." A murmur of surprise rippled through the gathered villagers, but Miss Marple found herself studying not the envelope, but the faces of those around her. Mr. Blackthorne had gone noticeably pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his spectacles. More significantly, she observed that he was not looking at the envelope with the same surprise as everyone else, but rather with the expression of someone whose worst fears were being confirmed. It was at this crucial moment that Mrs. Weatherby materialized from the crowd with the quiet authority of someone who had managed the village's postal affairs for 4 decades. Her examination of the envelope was swift but thorough, and her pronouncement carried the weight of professional expertise. "That blue express label has been cut from a sheet rather than torn from our standard roll," she observed, adjusting her spectacles to peer more closely at the envelope. "And the postmark, while it appears to show London and yesterday's date, has been applied with rather more pressure than our postal clocks typically use. The impression is too deep, and the ink has spread slightly at the edges." Young Tom Pierce, who had been listening with growing confusion, suddenly spoke up. "But Mr. Blackthorne said it came in the morning bag from London. He gave it to me specially because it was so important." All eyes turned to Mr. Blackthorne, who seemed to shrink under the collective scrutiny. His earlier composure had completely evaporated, replaced by the desperate expression of someone whose carefully constructed deception was unraveling before his eyes. That is, the envelope did arrive this morning," he stammered, his voice lacking any conviction. "Perhaps the contents became separated during transit. These things sometimes happen with express mail." Mrs. Weatherby's expression suggested that such things most certainly did not happen, at least not in any post office under her supervision. Miss Marple noted that Mr. Blackthorne's explanation raised more questions than it answered, particularly regarding why he had felt compelled to personally ensure the delivery of what was, apparently, an empty envelope. The mystery was deepening rather than resolving, and Miss Marple found herself increasingly certain that the afternoon's tragedy was neither accident nor coincidence, but the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan that had somehow gone awry. The letter that had arrived too late was beginning to seem less like a delayed message and more like a deliberate deception, though its ultimate purpose remained tantalizingly unclear. As Inspector Slack began to organize a more thorough search of the immediate area, Miss Marple continued her quiet observation, confident that the truth would eventually emerge through the careful accumulation of small details and the patient understanding of human nature that had served her so well in previous investigations. The constable's methodical search of the area behind the marquee began to yield results as the afternoon light slanted through the hedge, casting dappled shadows across the ground where Mrs. Carroway had met her end. Inspector Slack supervised with the determined air of someone who believed that physical evidence would provide clearer answers than the conflicting testimonies of village witnesses. Miss Marple watched from her strategic position, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm while her keen eyes missed nothing of the unfolding investigation. It was near the base of the privet hedge that the constable's careful probing produced a small but significant discovery. With an exclamation of satisfaction, he withdrew a torn fragment of paper, no larger than a postage stamp, caught among the lower branches where someone might have hastily discarded it. Inspector Slack examined the scrap with obvious pleasure, noting aloud that it bore the distinctive watermark and partial letterhead of Messrs. Whitmore, Carstairs and Associates. Someone was in quite a hurry, Inspector Slack announced with conviction, holding the fragment up to catch the light. This wasn't torn carefully, but ripped away quickly, as if the person wanted to destroy evidence but didn't have time to do it properly. The implication hung in the air like smoke, suggesting that Mrs. Carroway's death had been preceded by the deliberate destruction of whatever document had originally occupied the mysterious envelope. Dr. Rowe, who had been observing the proceedings with the quiet attention of someone wrestling with professional concerns, approached Inspector Slack with the diffident manner of a man who wished to contribute useful information without overstepping his authority. "Inspector, I've been reconsidering my initial examination of Mrs. Carroway," he said carefully. "The wound on her finger from the fruit knife had already begun to clot when I examined her, which suggests it occurred several minutes before her death, not at the moment of collapse." This medical observation introduced a troubling timeline that complicated the apparent simplicity of the case. If Mrs. Carroway had injured herself while opening the envelope, then survived long enough for the wound to begin healing before whatever had actually caused her death, it suggested that the envelope's contents, whatever they might have been, were not the immediate cause of her demise. Something else had occurred in that shadowed space behind the marquee, something that had happened after she had already processed whatever message the envelope was intended to convey. Young Tom Pierce, who had been listening to these adult deliberations with the fascinated attention of someone discovering that the world contained far more complexity than he had imagined, suddenly contributed an observation that cast Mr. Blackthorne's behavior in an even more suspicious light. "Mr. Blackthorne was very particular about when I should deliver it," Tom said earnestly, his voice carrying clearly across the green. "He told me to wait until Mrs. Carroway was settled at the fete, and to make sure everyone could see me giving it to her. He said it was important that she receive it publicly, so there would be witnesses to proper delivery." The implications of this revelation sent a visible shiver through the assembled villagers. The envelope's delivery had apparently been orchestrated as a performance rather than a simple postal transaction, suggesting that Mr. Blackthorne had wanted witnesses to Mrs. Carroway's receipt of whatever message he was conveying. Miss Marple found this detail particularly intriguing, for in her extensive experience with human nature, she had observed that people who insisted upon public witnesses to their actions were usually either protecting themselves against future accusations or ensuring that their victims could not later deny having received whatever they were being given. Inspector Slack's attention fixed upon Mr. Blackthorne with renewed intensity, and the postmaster seemed to wilt under the collective scrutiny of his neighbors. His earlier composure had completely evaporated, replaced by the desperate expression of someone whose carefully constructed explanations were proving inadequate to the circumstances he faced. The assembled villagers began offering their own theories about the unfolding mystery with the particular enthusiasm that shocking events generate in small communities. Mrs. Bantry whispered about secret love affairs and discarded suitors, while Colonel Hartnell declared with military certainty that inheritance disputes were at the root of most domestic tragedies. Miss Denham, pale but thoughtful, suggested that people in novels died of shock more often than doctors were willing to admit in real life. Miss Marple listened to these speculations with the patient attention of someone who understood that truth often emerged not from the obvious explanations, but from the careful observation of details that others overlooked. The empty envelope, the staged delivery, the torn paper fragment, and the medical timeline all suggested a complexity that went far beyond Inspector Slack's growing certainty that Mr. Blackthorne was their culprit. In her experience, the most obvious suspect was rarely the actual perpetrator, and she found herself increasingly convinced that the afternoon's tragedy was merely the visible culmination of a much more intricate web of relationships and motivations that had been developing beneath the placid surface of village life for some considerable time. The investigation was indeed focusing on Mr. Blackthorne, but Miss Marple suspected that the real truth lay in directions that had not yet been explored, hidden among the small details and human observations that patient attention would eventually reveal. The lengthening shadows across the village green seemed to deepen the mystery, rather than illuminate it, as Inspector Slack's investigation began to reveal layers of deception that went far beyond a simple case of postal fraud. Miss Marple had positioned herself near the demonstration table where young Tom had spent the afternoon stamping souvenir cards, her keen eyes studying the rubber date stamp with the particular attention she reserved for details that others might overlook. The stamp itself told a fascinating story to someone who knew how to read the signs. The ink pad bore traces of the same blue-black substance that had created the suspicious postmark on Mrs. Carraway's envelope. And more significantly, the metal collar around the date wheel showed clear fingerprint smudges where someone had adjusted it with less than steady hands. Most telling of all was a tiny nick in the outer circle of the stamp, barely visible unless one knew to look for it, which appeared on every impression Tom had made during the afternoon's festivities. "Tom, dear," Miss Marple said gently, beckoning the boy with her characteristic mixture of authority and kindness. "I wonder if you might show me one of your stamped cards. They're quite beautifully done." When Tom proudly produced his work, Miss Marple compared it carefully to the envelope that had caused such disturbance. The match was unmistakable. The same nick, the same heavy pressure, the same slight bleeding of ink at the edges. "Inspector Slack," she called softly, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had solved many mysteries over the years. "I believe you'll find this rather interesting. The postmark on Mrs. Carraway's envelope was made right here at the Fit, using Tom's demonstration stamp." This revelation sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled villagers, for it meant that someone had deliberately created the false postmark as part of their deception. Inspector Slack examined the evidence with grudging admiration for Miss Marple's observational skills, though he remained convinced that Mr. Blackthorne was their culprit. Dr. Rowe, who had been conducting a more thorough examination of Mrs. Carraway's personal effects with the inspector's permission, approached with information that cast the afternoon's events in an entirely different light. "Inspector, I've discovered something rather significant," he said quietly, mindful of the listening crowd. "There are traces of red sealing wax beneath Mrs. Carraway's fingernails, and the pattern suggests she opened a document sealed in the traditional manner that solicitors use for important legal communications." The implication was clear. Mrs. Carraway had indeed received and opened a genuine legal document, despite the empty envelope found in her possession. Someone had removed the original contents after her death, substituting the empty envelope to conceal whatever information the real document had contained. Under renewed pressure from Inspector Slack's questioning, Mr. Blackthorne's composure finally began to crack in earnest. His explanations became increasingly convoluted as he attempted to justify his role in the afternoon's deception, and eventually he admitted to a connection that cast his behavior in a more understandable, if not entirely innocent, light. "The letter concerned Mrs. Carraway's inheritance," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Her late husband's will contained a clause that required her to take certain actions by a specific date or forfeit a considerable sum. Today was that deadline." He paused, wiping perspiration from his brow with a trembling hand. I was asked to ensure she received proper notification and to make certain there were witnesses to the delivery so she couldn't later claim ignorance of the deadline." "Asked by whom?" Inspector Slack demanded, but Mr. Blackthorn's answer was lost in the sudden commotion that arose from the direction of the postal exhibition. The constable, who had been guarding the area, came running toward them with obvious agitation. "Inspector, someone's disturbed the display. The frame with the historical letter has been smashed, and there's blood on the broken glass. It happened while we were all focused on the post office." This development introduced a new element of urgency to the investigation, for it suggested that someone was still actively working to conceal evidence or eliminate traces of their involvement. Miss Marple observed the faces around her with particular attention, noting who seemed genuinely surprised by this news and who appeared to have been expecting it. The mystery was deepening rather than resolving, and she found herself increasingly convinced that the afternoon's tragedy was merely the visible culmination of a much more complex web of relationships and motivations that had been developing beneath the surface of village life. The inheritance deadline provided a clear motive, but the question remained: who else besides Mr. Blackthorn had known about Mrs. Carraway's legal situation, and who had enough at stake to resort to murder to prevent her from meeting the conditions of her husband's will? As Inspector Slack organized a search for the missing historical document and whoever had disturbed the exhibition, Miss Marple continued her patient observation, confident that the truth would emerge through the careful accumulation of small details and the understanding of human nature that had served her so well in previous investigations. The letter that had arrived too late was beginning to reveal its secrets, but she suspected that the most important revelations were yet to come. The examination of the shattered exhibition frame revealed a complexity of evidence that transformed Inspector Slack's investigation from a simple case of postal fraud into something far more intricate and personal. Miss Marple approached the damaged display with her characteristic measured steps, her keen eyes studying the pattern of destruction with the particular attention she reserved for details that others might dismiss as coincidental. The glass had been broken from the inside outward, suggesting deliberate force rather than accidental damage. More significantly, the blood droplets scattered across the remaining shards told a story of desperation and haste. 3 distinct spots marked the white tablecloth beneath the frame, each showing the characteristic pattern of drops that had fallen from a height, indicating someone had stood over the display while bleeding from a fresh wound. Dr. Rowe's medical examination of the blood evidence confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions about the timing. "This occurred within the last hour," he announced quietly to Inspector Slack, while our attention was focused on the investigation near the marquee. "Whoever broke this frame cut themselves significantly in the process and would require immediate medical attention." It was at this moment that Miss Denham approached the group with obvious reluctance, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. Her left hand, Miss Marple noted with interest, was wrapped in what appeared to be a hastily improvised bandage made from a tea towel rather than proper medical supplies. "Inspector," Miss Denham said hesitantly, "I'm afraid I may have witnessed something important earlier. About 20 minutes ago, when everyone was listening to your questions about the envelope, I noticed someone examining the historical display very carefully. They seemed to be looking for something specific rather than simply reading the exhibit." Inspector Slack pressed for details, and Miss Denham's account painted a picture of purposeful behavior that had gone unnoticed in the general confusion. The person, she observed, had approached the display with clear intent, spending considerable time studying the frame before glancing around to ensure they were unobserved. Most tellingly, they had been wearing gloves despite the warm afternoon weather. Mrs. Weatherby, whose decades of postal service had given her an encyclopedic knowledge of village correspondence, provided crucial context that connected the afternoon's events to a longer pattern of legal pressure. Mrs. Carraway had been receiving urgent letters from that London solicitor's firm for the past 3 months, she revealed with authority, always requiring signature confirmation and always causing her considerable distress when they arrived. The postmarks showed they were sent by special courier, not ordinary post. This revelation prompted Mr. Blackthorne to provide additional details about the inheritance situation under Inspector Slack's renewed questioning. "The telephone call yesterday evening was very specific," he admitted, his composure finally cracking under the weight of scrutiny. The caller, who identified himself as Mr. Wade from the estate office, explained that Mrs. Carraway faced a deadline today at 3 o'clock to sign occupancy papers for a property called Briar Cottage. If she failed to meet this deadline, the inheritance would pass to an alternate beneficiary. Miss Marple's attention sharpened at this information, for the 3 o'clock deadline had passed more than an hour ago, well before Mrs. Carraway's death. This timing suggested that someone had ensured she would be unable to meet the legal requirement, though whether through the delayed delivery or more direct intervention remained unclear. The historical letter that had been stolen from the display now took on new significance in light of these revelations. Mr. Blackthorne explained that it had documented a similar case from 1911 involving the Ashworth family and how a delayed notification had caused a young heir to forfeit a substantial inheritance to a distant cousin. The parallel to Mrs. Carraway's situation was too precise to be mere coincidence. The original letter described how Arthur Ashworth missed his appointment with the London solicitors because his notification arrived too late. Mr. Blackthorne continued, his voice growing stronger as he realized the implications. The inheritance passed to Herbert Ashworth instead, and eventually to more distant relatives when Herbert died without direct heirs. Dr. Rowe, who had been listening with growing comprehension, added a crucial piece of local knowledge. The Ashworth estate is now owned by Mr. Alistair Finch, who inherited through that distant family line. Briar Cottage sits on what was once Ashworth land, though it was sold off separately years ago. Miss Marple found herself studying the faces around her with renewed interest, noting who seemed genuinely surprised by these revelations and who appeared to have been expecting them. The theft of the historical letter suggested that someone feared its contents might provide evidence relevant to current legal proceedings, though the precise nature of that connection remained tantalizingly unclear. As Inspector Slack organized a search for the missing document and began questioning those present about their whereabouts during the crucial 20-minute period, Miss Marple continued her patient observation. The truth was beginning to emerge through careful accumulation of evidence, but she suspected the most important revelations lay hidden among the complex relationships that connected past and present in ways that were only now becoming apparent. The afternoon shadows continued to lengthen across the village green as Inspector Slack's investigation began to reveal layers of deception that extended far beyond the simple postal fraud he had initially suspected. Miss Marple observed the proceedings with her characteristic patience, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm while her keen eyes catalogued every detail that others might overlook. It was young Tom Pierce who provided the crucial connection that transformed Miss Denham from concerned witness to potential suspect. When Inspector Slack pressed him about his demonstration activities, Tom mentioned with the earnest helpfulness of youth that he had mislaid his inking rag during his lemonade break. "I set it right beside the stamp pad," he explained, "but when I came back, it was gone. Had to wipe my fingers on my sleeve instead." Miss Marple's attention shifted immediately to Miss Denham's hastily bandaged hand, noting with interest the blue-black stain that had soaked through the improvised tea-towel wrapping. The color was distinctly different from the brownish marks that tea or blood would leave, matching instead the particular shade of the postal ink that had been used to create the suspicious postmark on Mrs. Carraway's envelope. Dr. Rowe's examination of Miss Denham's injury confirmed that the wound was indeed fresh and consistent with broken glass, but the presence of the ink stain suggested her involvement with the postal demonstration went beyond mere accident. When pressed by Inspector Slack about her movements during the crucial period, Miss Denham's explanations became increasingly vague and contradictory. The arrival of Mr. Alistair Finch added a new dimension to the investigation that commanded everyone's immediate attention. A tall, distinguished gentleman in his early 50s, he approached the gathering with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority, yet maintained the carefully modulated concern appropriate to the circumstances. His introduction of himself as the owner of Ashworth Lodge and potential beneficiary of Mrs. Carroway's forfeited inheritance sent a ripple of recognition through the assembled villagers. "I came as soon as word reached me," Mr. Finch explained to Inspector Slack with polished sincerity. Mrs. Carroway was, of course, perfectly within her rights regarding Briar Cottage, and I had no desire to pressure her about the inheritance deadline. My solicitors handled all communications through proper channels. Inspector Slack's interest sharpened considerably when Mr. Finch mentioned his London legal representation. "That would be Messrs. Whitmore, Carstairs and Associates?" he inquired, consulting his notebook with obvious satisfaction. "Indeed," Mr. Finch confirmed. "Though I must say, I was surprised to learn of any urgency regarding today's deadline. My instructions to the firm were quite clear that Mrs. Carroway should have adequate time to consider her options." This statement prompted Mr. Blackthorne to interject with nervous energy. But the telephone call last evening was very specific about the 3 o'clock deadline. Mr. Wade from your estate office emphasized the critical nature of the timing. Mr. Finch's expression shifted to one of polite confusion. "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. My estate office is located in Exeter, not London, and is managed by Mr. Chudley, not any Mr. Wade. If someone telephoned claiming to represent my interests, they were acting without my knowledge or authority." The implications of this revelation sent Inspector Slack into immediate action. He dispatched his constable to the telephone exchange to trace the previous evening's call, and the results proved even more illuminating than expected. The village operator confirmed that no trunk call from London had been placed to the post office the previous evening. However, there had been a local connection from the Red Lion's public call box to Mr. Blackthorne's residence, placed shortly after 8 o'clock by someone claiming to be Mr. Wade and speaking with what the publican described as a put-on London accent. This discovery transformed the investigation from a case of inheritance fraud to one of elaborate local deception. Someone with intimate knowledge of both Mrs. Carroway's legal situation and the village's postal procedures had orchestrated the entire sequence of events, from the false telephone call to the staged delivery of the empty envelope. Mrs. Weatherby, whose decades of postal experience had given her an encyclopedic knowledge of proper procedures, provided additional evidence of the deception's sophistication. "The envelope's construction was quite clever," she observed with professional admiration. "Someone had clearly studied our standard express delivery formats, but there were subtle differences that only long experience would detect." Miss Marple found herself studying the faces around her with renewed attention, noting who seemed genuinely surprised by these revelations and who appeared to have been expecting them. The theft of the historical letter from the damaged exhibition suggested that someone feared its contents might provide evidence relevant to current legal proceedings, though the precise nature of that connection remained tantalizingly unclear. Dr. Rowe, who had been examining the blood evidence at the exhibition site with methodical precision, announced that the pattern of droplets suggested someone had stood over the display while bleeding from a fresh wound, confirming that the frame had been deliberately broken rather than accidentally damaged. The timing coincided precisely with the period when everyone's attention had been focused on Inspector Slack's questioning near the marquee. The investigation was revealing a web of deception that involved multiple participants, each with their own motives and opportunities. Miss Denham's injury and possession of the missing ink rag connected her directly to both the postal fraud and the exhibition theft, while Mr. Finch's convenient arrival and polished explanations raised questions about his true involvement in the evening's orchestrated events. As Inspector Slack organized a more thorough search of the immediate area and began preparing for individual interrogations, Miss Marple continued her patient observation. The truth was beginning to emerge through the careful accumulation of evidence, but she suspected that the most crucial revelations lay hidden among the complex relationships that connected past and present in ways that were only now becoming apparent. The letter that had arrived too late was revealing its secrets, but the full scope of the deception remained tantalizingly just beyond reach. The evening air settled across the village green with the particular stillness that follows shocking revelations, as if the very atmosphere were holding its breath, while Inspector Slack's investigation continued to unravel layers of carefully constructed deception. Miss Marple maintained her position near the oak tree, her knitting needles moving with their characteristic gentle rhythm, while her keen eyes observed the subtle changes in behavior that others might dismiss as mere nervousness. The constable's return from his expanded search brought with it discoveries that transformed the afternoon's mystery from postal fraud into something far more sinister. Hidden beneath a loose board in the storage shed behind the church, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, lay both the stolen historical letter and what appeared to be the genuine legal document that had been removed from Mrs. Carraway's possession after her death. Inspector Slack's examination of the recovered papers revealed the true sophistication of the deception that had been orchestrated. The historical letter from 1911 contained modern annotations in blue-black ink, connecting Arthur Ashworth's missed inheritance directly to Mrs. Carraway's current situation. More significantly, the genuine legal document from Messrs. Whitmore, Carstairs and Associates contained a deadline extension that would have given Mrs. Carraway until the end of the month to complete her inheritance paperwork, completely contradicting the urgent 3 o'clock deadline that had caused such distress. Dr. Rowe's examination of the documents confirmed the presence of red sealing wax residue that matched the traces found beneath Mrs. Carraway's fingernails, proving that she had indeed opened and read the genuine communication before someone had removed it from her possession and substituted the empty envelope that had caused such public drama. Miss Marple found her attention drawn increasingly to Miss Denham, whose composed demeanor was showing signs of strain that grew more pronounced with each revelation. The school teacher's bandaged hand trembled slightly as the evidence mounted, and the blue-black ink stain that had soaked through her improvised bandage seemed to pulse with silent accusation in the fading light. "My dear Miss Denham," Miss Marple said gently, approaching with the unhurried steps of someone making a social call. "You must be quite shaken by all this unpleasantness, such a terrible end to what should have been a lovely afternoon." She settled herself nearby, her knitting providing the perfect cover for careful observation. "I noticed you were particularly interested in the historical display earlier. Such fascinating parallels between past and present, don't you think?" Miss Denham's response carried a nervous flutter that was entirely unlike her usual composed authority. "Indeed, Miss Marple, though I confess I found the details rather dry. My interests lean more toward the educational aspects of postal history." Her gesture toward the remaining exhibition materials was awkward, her bandaged hand conspicuously still. "Ah, but the human element is always the most instructive," Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had encouraged countless confessions over the years. "Consider the meticulous planning required for such a deception. Someone with keen attention to detail, perhaps even familiarity with postal procedures, would be needed to orchestrate such a convincing performance. And then, to remove evidence of such a plot by destroying the very historical example that mirrored one's own actions, that would be the desperate act of someone who feared exposure." The color drained from Miss Denham's face as the implications of Miss Marple's observations became clear. Young Tom Pierce, who had been listening with the fascinated attention of someone discovering that adults were capable of far more complexity than he had imagined, suddenly provided a crucial piece of information. "Miss Denham borrowed my bicycle yesterday evening," he announced with helpful enthusiasm. "She said she needed to visit someone in the next village, but when she returned it this morning, the chain was all muddy as if she'd ridden through the woods rather than on the main road." This revelation prompted Inspector Slack to question Miss Denham more directly about her movements the previous evening. Her explanations became increasingly convoluted as she attempted to account for the bicycle journey, eventually admitting to visiting the Red Lion, though she claimed it was merely to purchase cigarettes rather than to use the public telephone. The publican's testimony, when summoned to provide clarification, contradicted Miss Denham's account in several crucial details. He confirmed that she had indeed used the call box around 8 o'clock, speaking in what he described as a carefully practiced London accent to someone at the post office. More tellingly, he had observed her consulting written notes during the conversation, suggesting that her performance as the mysterious Mr. Wade had been carefully rehearsed rather than improvised. Mrs. Weatherby's examination of the recovered documents with her decades of postal expertise revealed that the modern annotations on the historical letter were written in the same distinctive hand as the false telephone message details that Mr. Blackthorne had noted during his conversation. The connection was unmistakable, linking Miss Denham directly to the elaborate deception that had been planned and executed with such careful attention to detail. Miss Marple observed the small physical evidence that told its own story. The hem of Miss Denham's skirt bore 2 tiny briar thorns, the curved kind that caught and held, suggesting recent contact with the hedgerows around Briar Cottage. Combined with the red sealing wax residue on her glove and the blue-black ink stains on her bandage, the evidence painted a picture of someone who had been intimately involved in every aspect of the afternoon's tragic events. Dr. Rowe's continued analysis of the timeline suggested that Mrs. Carraway's death had occurred after she had read the genuine legal document and discovered the deception that had been orchestrated around her inheritance. This timing implied that her murder had been motivated not by preventing her from meeting an artificial deadline, but by silencing her after she had learned the truth about the conspiracy against her. As Inspector Slack prepared to confront Miss Denham with the mounting evidence against her, the constable returned with urgent news that cast the investigation in an entirely new direction. "Inspector," he called breathlessly. "Young Tom's discovered something at Briar Cottage. The door's been forced, there's a light inside, and the spare key that Mrs. Weatherby kept at the post office has gone missing." The implications of this discovery sent a ripple of alarm through the assembled villagers, for it suggested that someone was still actively working to complete whatever scheme had begun with Mrs. Carraway's murder. Miss Marple noted that Miss Denham's face had gone completely white at the mention of Briar Cottage, and that her nervous glances toward the darkening lane suggested knowledge of activities that extended beyond the afternoon's public deception. Inspector Slack immediately organized a party to investigate the cottage, including Dr. Rowe for medical expertise and Mr. Blackthorne, whose cooperation might prove essential to understanding the full scope of the conspiracy. Miss Denham started to follow, then checked herself with the careful calculation of someone whose every movement had become significant evidence. As the investigation prepared to move to its next crucial phase, Miss Marple found herself certain that the truth was finally within reach, hidden among the shadows and secrets of Briar Cottage, where Mrs. Carraway's inheritance had become the center of a web of deception that had ultimately cost her life. The walk to Briar Cottage through the gathering dusk carried with it the weight of accumulated evidence and unspoken suspicions as Inspector Slack's party followed the narrow lane between ancient hedgerows toward the property that had become the center of such deadly deception. Miss Marple accompanied the group with her characteristic measured pace, her keen eyes noting the fresh bicycle tracks in the soft earth and the way the cottage windows glowed with an unwelcome intensity against the darkening sky. The cottage itself sat behind its rose-choked hedge with an air of violated privacy, the front door standing ajar to reveal the harsh glow of electric light within. Inspector Slack's examination of the entrance confirmed the constable's earlier observations about forced entry, though Miss Marple noted with interest that the splintering around the lock showed the peculiar pattern of damage inflicted from within to appear as external force, the work of someone familiar with the cottage's construction and eager to create a convincing deception. Inside, the scene that greeted them was one of methodical search rather than random burglary. Papers lay scattered across the sitting room table in organized piles, while a heavy wooden chest in the corner stood open, its contents carefully examined rather than hastily ransacked. The air held an acrid tang of recently burned paper and something faintly metallic that Dr. Rowe identified as traces of sealing wax that had been heated and manipulated. The hearth told its own story of desperate concealment. Beneath a thin layer of fresh ash, the fire iron revealed the charred remains of documents that had been burned with careful attention to destroying specific evidence. Miss Marple observed that whoever had conducted this destruction had been selective rather than panicked, targeting particular papers while leaving others untouched, the behavior of someone who knew exactly what needed to be eliminated. It was at this crucial moment that Miss Denham appeared in the cottage doorway, her bandaged hand clutched to her breast and her face bearing the expression of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. Her explanation about fetching school records faltered immediately upon seeing the evidence of systematic document destruction, and the blue-black ink stain that had soaked through her improvised bandage seemed to pulse with silent accusation in the lamplight. "My dear Miss Denham," Miss Marple said gently, settling herself in the cottage's one comfortable chair as if making a social call, "you must be quite distressed to venture out on such an unpleasant errand. Though I confess I'm puzzled about why Mrs. Carraway's school appeal records would be kept here at Briar Cottage rather than at your schoolhouse." The school teacher's composure cracked visibly under this gentle questioning, and her attempts at explanation became increasingly contradictory as Inspector Slack pressed for details about her movements during the crucial evening hours. The evidence mounted steadily. The spare key from Mrs. Weatherby's post office found in Miss Denham's possession, the red sealing wax residue on her gloves that matched the traces found beneath Mrs. Carraway's fingernails, and most damning of all, the discovery of detailed floor plans of Briar Cottage hidden among the burned documents. Dr. Rowe's examination of the cottage revealed additional evidence of premeditation that painted a disturbing picture of long-term planning. Hidden beneath loose floorboards, they discovered correspondence between Miss Denham and various property developers expressing interest in the educational potential of the cottage and its grounds. The letters, dating back several months, showed that she had been researching the property's value and potential uses well before Mrs. Carraway's inheritance deadline had become urgent. Under Inspector Slack's methodical questioning, the true scope of Miss Denham's desperation began to emerge. The village school faced closure due to declining enrollment and insufficient funds, threatening not only her livelihood but her entire sense of purpose and identity within the community. Mrs. Carraway's inheritance represented salvation, not just personal gain, but the resources needed to transform Briar Cottage into an educational facility that could secure the school's future indefinitely. "The most tragic aspect," Miss Marple observed quietly to Dr. Rowe as they listened to Miss Denham's increasingly frantic justifications, "is that Mrs. Carraway was genuinely fond of children and education. A simple, honest appeal for help might have achieved everything that this terrible deception has destroyed." This observation prompted Miss Denham to break down partially, admitting that she had indeed approached Mrs. Carraway months earlier about the school's difficulties. Mrs. Carraway had promised to consider substantial assistance once her inheritance matters were settled, but Miss Denham's impatience and growing desperation had driven her to increasingly extreme measures when the promised help seemed too slow in coming. The physical evidence continued to mount as Inspector Slack's systematic search revealed the tools of deception that had been used to orchestrate the afternoon's tragedy. Hidden in the cottage's pantry, they found the rubber stamp that had been used to create false postmarks, along with supplies of Blue Express labels and sealing wax that matched the materials found at the crime scene. Most significantly, they discovered a detailed timeline showing Mrs. Carraway's legal requirements and the precise moments when intervention would be most effective. Miss Marple studied the burned documents with particular attention, noting that while most had been destroyed beyond recognition, several fragments remained that told their own story. One partially preserved letter bore Mrs. Carraway's handwriting, expressing concern about pressure she had been receiving to make hasty decisions about her inheritance, specifically mentioning conversations with a trusted local person who had been offering unsolicited advice about educational charity. As Inspector Slack prepared to confront Miss Denham with the overwhelming evidence against her, the school teacher's final defenses began to crumble. Her admission that she had orchestrated the false telephone call and arranged the staged delivery of the empty envelope came in broken fragments, each revelation more damaging than the last. The theft of the historical letter had been an attempt to remove evidence of her research into similar inheritance frauds, while the break-in at Briar Cottage represented her desperate final attempt to secure documents that would establish her claim to the property. "I never meant for her to die," Miss Denham whispered finally, her voice barely audible above the cottage's settling timbers. "The plan was simply to ensure she missed the deadline. But when she read the real document and realized what I had done, she threatened to expose everything. The school would have been destroyed, and all those children." Her voice trailed off as the full weight of her actions settled upon her. Dr. Rowe's quiet examination of the timeline confirmed the tragic sequence of events. Mrs. Carraway had indeed discovered the deception when she read the genuine, legal document with its deadline extension, realizing that the urgent 3 o'clock requirement had been fabricated. Her confrontation with Miss Denham behind the marquee had escalated beyond mere exposure of fraud into something far more desperate and final. Inspector Slack began organizing the evidence for formal charges, but Miss Marple sensed that crucial elements of the mystery remained unresolved. Miss Denham's confession, while comprehensive regarding her own actions, left questions about other participants in the conspiracy that had made such elaborate deception possible. The investigation was nearing its conclusion, but she suspected that the final revelations would require one more careful examination of the human motivations that had transformed a dedicated educator's noble intentions into a web of lies that had ultimately cost an innocent woman her life. As they prepared to return to the village green with their prisoner, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony that had driven someone whose life was dedicated to nurturing young minds to commit such a desperate act. The letter that had arrived too late had indeed changed everything, though the true tragedy lay not in postal timing, but in the failure of human communication and trust that might have prevented the entire catastrophe. The return to the village green under the deepening twilight carried with it an atmosphere of unfinished business that Miss Marple found deeply troubling. While Miss Denham's confession had provided answers to many questions about the elaborate postal deception, certain crucial elements of Mrs. Carraway's death remained stubbornly inconsistent with the schoolteacher's account of events. As Inspector Slack organized his evidence and prepared formal charges, Miss Marple settled once again in her chair beneath the oak tree, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm while her keen mind worked through the troubling discrepancies that others seemed eager to overlook. The physical evidence told a story that differed significantly from Miss Denham's tearful admission of responsibility. Mrs. Carraway's body had been found in what Dr. Rowe himself had described as an unusually composed arrangement, with her limbs positioned in a manner that suggested careful attention rather than the natural collapse one would expect from either a heart attack or the aftermath of a violent struggle. More significantly, the wound from the silver fruit knife had already begun to clot when Dr. Rowe first examined her, indicating that several minutes had elapsed between the injury and her death. Time enough for someone to have intervened in ways that Miss Denham's hasty confession had not addressed. "Inspector Slack," Miss Marple said gently, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had resolved many previous mysteries. "I wonder if we might examine Miss Denham's account more carefully. You see, there's a rather significant problem with the timing that troubles me, considerably." She gestured with one knitting needle toward the spot where the afternoon's interrogations had taken place. When Mrs. Carraway walked behind the marquee to read her letter in private, Miss Denham was sitting right here beside me, making that rather literary observation about people in novels dying of shock more often than doctors allow in real life. She remained in conversation with me for several minutes, discussing the heat and the general excitement of the afternoon. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with growing confusion, for the timeline Miss Marple described created an impossible situation if Miss Denham was to be held responsible for Mrs. Carraway's death. The schoolteacher's confession, while emotionally compelling and certainly true regarding the postal fraud, could not account for the actual moment of murder if she had been publicly visible in conversation during the crucial period. Dr. Rowe, who had been listening to this exchange with the careful attention he brought to all medical discussions, stepped forward with what appeared to be helpful clarification. Miss Marple, I believe you may be mistaken about the precise timing. When I followed Mrs. Carraway to offer assistance, I found her already collapsed. The shock of discovering the deception, combined with the afternoon heat and her recent sleeping difficulties, would have been quite sufficient to cause cardiac arrest in someone of her age and constitution. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes fixed upon the doctor with the gentle persistence that had unraveled many carefully constructed deceptions. Yes, Dr. Rowe, you did follow her, didn't you? Most thoughtfully, as any concerned physician would when observing a patient in distress. And you were, as you mentioned, the first to reach her after young Tom's discovery. You examined her with such professional thoroughness and took such care to arrange her properly, closing her eyes, straightening her dress, ensuring she appeared dignified in death. The doctor nodded with the composed manner of someone discussing routine professional duties. Naturally, it was a matter of basic respect and proper medical protocol. Of course, Miss Marple agreed warmly. Though I confess I'm puzzled by one small detail. You mentioned that the wound from the fruit knife had already begun to clot when you first examined her, suggesting it occurred several minutes before her death. Yet Mrs. Carraway had only just opened the envelope and discovered the deception moments before she died. If the knife wound came first and her death followed several minutes later, what exactly happened during that interval? Dr. Rowe's composed expression showed the first signs of strain as he considered his response. The sequence of shock, injury, and cardiac failure in elderly patients can be quite complex, Miss Marple. The body's response to extreme stress often follows unpredictable patterns. Indeed, Miss Marple said gently, her needles never pausing in their rhythm. And your medical training would have given you intimate knowledge of exactly how such responses might be encouraged, shall we say, in someone already weakened by stress and poor sleep. A hand pressed firmly over the nose and mouth for just a few moments would be quite sufficient to precipitate cardiac arrest in someone of Mrs. Carraway's condition, particularly if she was already weakened by shock and the loss of blood from her injury. The silence that followed this observation was profound, broken only by the distant sound of chairs being stacked in the parish hall and the gentle rustle of evening wind through the bunting. Inspector Slack looked from Miss Marple to Dr. Rowe with growing comprehension, while Miss Denham raised her head with an expression of dawning horror at the implications of what was being suggested. Dr. Rowe's carefully maintained composure finally began to crack under the weight of Miss Marple's gentle but relentless logic. "You don't understand the pressures," he said quietly, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. 15 years I've served this village, watching people suffer from inadequate medical care because we lack proper facilities and trained staff. Mrs. Carraway's inheritance could have funded a proper nursing service, modern equipment, everything this community needs to care for its elderly and infirm. Miss Marple nodded with the compassion that had encouraged countless confessions over the years. And when she discovered Miss Denham's deception and threatened to expose the entire scheme, you realized that your careful plans for medical improvement would be destroyed by scandal. A moment's intervention while she was already weakened and distressed, and the inheritance would pass to the Village Nursing Association Fund under the alternate provisions of her husband's will. The doctor's admission came in broken fragments, each revelation more damaging than the last. He had indeed followed Mrs. Carraway behind the marquee, ostensibly to offer medical assistance when she appeared distressed by the letter's contents. When she confronted him about the pressure he had been applying regarding charitable donations and his knowledge of her legal situation, their conversation had escalated beyond mere disagreement into something desperate and final. "She would have destroyed everything," Dr. Rowe whispered, his professional dignity finally crumbling entirely. Years of planning, the chance to provide proper medical care for the entire village, all lost because of one woman's stubborn pride. When she threatened to expose not just Miss Denham's foolishness, but my own involvement in encouraging her toward hasty charitable decisions, I saw decades of medical progress vanishing into scandal and recrimination. Inspector Slack moved forward with his handcuffs, but Miss Marple raised a gentle hand to delay the arrest for just a moment longer. "The tragedy, Dr. Rowe, is that Mrs. Carraway was genuinely sympathetic to medical needs and would likely have supported your nursing fund generously if you had simply asked honestly, rather than resorting to manipulation and pressure. Pride and impatience have transformed what could have been a blessing into a catastrophe that will help no one." As Dr. Rowe was led away into the gathering darkness, Miss Denham sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that her elaborate deception had provided cover for a far more serious crime than she had ever intended. The letter that had arrived too late had indeed changed everything, though the true tragedy lay not in postal timing, but in the failure of trust and communication that had driven good people to desperate acts. The investigation was drawing to its close, but Miss Marple knew that the reverberations of this afternoon's events would continue to shape the village for years to come, serving as a reminder that the most dangerous crimes often spring not from obvious malice, but from the corruption of noble intentions by pride, impatience, and the fatal assumption that ends can justify any means. The village green lay quiet under the star-filled sky, as the last of the evening's dramatic revelations settled into the collective memory of St. Mary Mead. The bunting that had welcomed the morning's festivities now hung limp and forgotten, while the abandoned cake competition tables bore silent witness to how quickly celebration could transform into tragedy. Miss Marple remained in her chair beneath the oak tree, her knitting needles moving with their characteristic gentle rhythm as she reflected on the human complexities that had led to such a devastating conclusion. Inspector Slack completed his arrangements with the methodical satisfaction of someone whose investigation had ultimately revealed the truth, though Miss Marple suspected he would never fully understand how close he had come to accepting a false confession that would have sent an innocent woman to prison while allowing the real murderer to escape justice. Miss Denham sat nearby in stunned silence, finally comprehending that her elaborate postal deception had provided the perfect cover for Dr. Rowe's more sinister intentions, and that her desperate attempt to save the village school had instead become the instrument of Mrs. Carraway's death. The irony was not lost on Miss Marple that both conspirators had been motivated by genuine desire to serve their community, yet their impatience and willingness to deceive had corrupted their noble intentions into something tragic and destructive. Dr. Rowe's 15 years of dedicated medical service would now be remembered only for his final, fatal failure of judgment, while Miss Denham's devotion to education had been twisted into the very deception that would likely cost her both career and reputation. Young Tom Pierce, overwhelmed by his central role in the afternoon's events, found comfort in Miss Marple's gentle explanation that his faithful execution of postal duties had been essential to uncovering the truth. "You see, dear," she said kindly, "your careful attention to proper procedures revealed the deception that others had worked so hard to conceal. Without your observations about the stamp and the timing, we might never have understood what really happened to poor Mrs. Carraway." Mr. Blackthorne, freed from suspicion but shaken by his unwitting participation in the conspiracy, expressed his intention to request transfer back to London Postal Service, feeling that village life had proven more complex and dangerous than his urban experience had prepared him to handle. Mrs. Weatherby, with the practical wisdom of 4 decades in postal management, assured him that such dramatic events were exceptional rather than typical of rural communities, though she acknowledged that human nature remained consistently unpredictable, regardless of geographic location. The genuine legal documents recovered from Briar Cottage revealed that Mrs. Carraway's inheritance had indeed included provisions for charitable donations, with the Village Nursing Association Fund specifically mentioned as a potential beneficiary. The cruel irony was that Dr. Rowe's patient, honest advocacy, might well have achieved his medical goals without resorting to the manipulation and pressure that had ultimately driven him to murder. Mr. Alistair Finch, whose arrival had initially seemed suspicious, proved to be exactly what he claimed, a distant heir with legitimate but limited interest in the inheritance outcome. His genuine concern for proper legal procedures and his immediate cooperation with the investigation demonstrated the difference between someone with potential financial interest and someone driven to criminal action by desperation and misguided nobility. As the village began to process the shocking revelation that their trusted physician had been capable of such calculated violence, Miss Marple reflected on the particular tragedy of crimes committed by those who had devoted their lives to helping others. The corruption of healing hands into instruments of death represented a betrayal not just of Mrs. Carraway's trust, but of the fundamental compact between medical professional and community that formed the foundation of civilized society. The Penny Post Jubilee would be remembered not for its celebration of communication and community service, but as the day when the failure of honest communication had led to deception, manipulation, and ultimately murder. The historical letter about messages that arrived too late had proven prophetic in ways that its original author could never have imagined, serving as both inspiration for fraud and evidence of premeditation that helped reveal the truth. As the evening deepened and the last of the investigators departed, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return to her cottage, leaving behind a village green that bore little resemblance to the festive gathering place it had been that morning. The transformation served as a powerful reminder that beneath the placid surface of even the most peaceful communities lay currents of ambition, desperation, and moral complexity that could erupt into tragedy when pride and impatience overcame wisdom and patience. The letter that had arrived too late had indeed changed everything, though not in the way anyone had expected. Mrs. Carraway's death would serve as a lasting reminder that the most dangerous deceptions often spring not from obvious malice, but from the gradual corruption of good intentions by the fatal belief that noble ends can justify any means.